everybody, this is ShadowXXC here and welcome to the second part of the PC Parts Explained series. In this video we'll be covering the graphics card, so without further ado let's get right into our first point, which is, what is a graphics card? A graphics card is a display adapter that lets video be sent to the monitor. It can also process things like shadows, tessellation, complex physics, particle effects, complex algebra, shadows, anti-aliasing and much more. Which leads us on to our next point. How does a graphics card work? Now, a graphics card is a very complex device to understand, so I'm going to split this up into multiple sections, starting off with VRAM. VRAM stands for Video Random Access Memory, also referred to as the frame buffer sometimes. VRAM is essentially a collection of memory chips on the graphics card's PCB. Their job is to store video frames and image data that will later be shown on the monitor. Generally, more VRAM is better, as the more VRAM you have, the more frames and video data you can store. However, there's another factor affecting VRAM performance: speed. There are many types of VRAM, all with varying speeds. However, the most commonly used ones are GDDR3, GDDR4, GDDR5 and GDDR6. GDDR4 and GDDR3 are quite slow, whereas GDDR5 and GDDR6 are regarded as the quicker ones, which is why they're most commonly used on modern graphics cards. Generally, top-end graphics cards will have GDDR6 memory with 8 to 24 GB of VRAM. Mid-range to high-end graphics cards will have 8 to 11 GB of VRAM, which will also be either GDDR5 or GDDR6. Entry-level graphics cards will usually have GDDR5 memory and a memory capacity of 2 to 4 GB. Now, on to our next component here, stream processors or CUDA cores. Now, if you've watched my CPU video, then you'll know what a core does. A core fetches, decodes and executes an instruction. Now, a graphics card also has cores. On NVIDIA graphics cards, they're called CUDA cores. On AMD graphics cards, they are called stream processors. Now, if you remember from my CPU video, CPUs usually have 1 to 64 cores. Now, graphics cards sometimes have hundreds, if not thousands, of these little cores. Now, generally, these cores will be less powerful than CPU cores. However, there's so much of them that what they lose in their individual power, they gain in their strength in numbers. Now, of course, CPUs and GPUs are fitted to different types of processing. GPUs will usually handle light physics, air physics, tessellation, anti-aliasing, FreeSync, VSync and G-Sync, and other such parallel programs, whereas a CPU will handle more variable instructions like acceleration, jerk, deceleration, speed, number of AI objects, AI in general, and other such variable programs that will have variable parameters. Now, saying that, there is differences in GPUs themselves when it comes to cores. For example, CUDA cores generally more powerful and more complex and a lot larger than AMD's stream processors, which is why AMD will usually have more stream processors than NVIDIA has CUDA cores. Now, there's another difference between GPU cores and CPU cores. It's that GPU cores will often be split up into different functions. What I mean by that is each core will have a different function it needs to perform. They're often split up into different clusters so that the processing can be easier between all the cores. Types of GPU core you'll usually find are shading units, which handle shading and shadows, texture mapping units, which will handle textures and mapping them to their correct place, which will handle physics and other such calculations, and render output units, which will process, render and combine all of the information from the previous cores, then send them to the VRAM. Now, moving on to our next component, which is cache. Now, I'm sure you'll remember cache if you watched my last video about the CPU, but for those who haven't, here's a little rundown. Cache is temporary memory that stores and feeds information into the processing unit, in this case the graphics card. There are generally 3 types of cache: L1 cache, which is the fastest, L2 cache, which is the second fastest, and L3 cache, which is the slowest. Generally, L3 cache will have the most amount of memory, L2 cache will have the second most amount of memory, and L1 cache will have the least amount of memory. Now, cache in GPUs actually works a bit differently than it does in CPUs, because in CPUs all the cores have to share cache with each other, whereas in a GPU each compute unit has its own L1 cache. However, usually they'll still have to share L2 and L3 cache. Now onto our final component, which is the PCIe bus. Now, to put it simply, the PCIe bus is essentially the connector that the GPU uses to connect to the motherboard. There are multiple generations of PCIe, PCIe 1, 2, 3 and 4. 3 is the most commonly used in modern motherboards. However, some newer high-end motherboards have started including PCIe 4, which is the fastest one. However, PCIe speed also depends on what PCIe connector it's using. Generally, modern graphics cards will use PCIe X16 or X8, PCIe X16 being the fastest. Can still use X8, but generally it'll be 1 to 2% slower. That concludes the hardware explanation in this video. Now we are moving on to how does a GPU help me in gaming? Now, as we've explained before, GPUs handle tessellation, shading, complex physics, light physics, and other such complex instruction sets. In gaming, this can be anisotropic filtering, anti-aliasing settings, shadows, cloth physics, fluid dynamic physics, shaders, particle simulation, and much more. So as you can see from all of that, the GPU is very important in games, even more so than the CPU. However, some calculations still need to be handled by the CPU, for example AI, NPCs and other variable tasks that have a certain degree of unpredictability to them. Now onto our final topic, how to install a graphics card. So first, take your graphics card, flip it so that the cooler is facing upside down. Next, locate the PCIe slot on your motherboard. This should look like this. Locate the clip next to it and unlatch it by pushing down on it until you hear a click. Next, line your card up with the slot, ensuring that the card is properly aligned before pushing it in. Next, you want to push the card in firmly, but don't apply too much force as you could damage something. Once you hear a click, you'll know the card is installed. If you don't hear a click, but you believe the card is firmly in, try putting the latch on top of this little notch right here. If the card seems firmly snug in place, make sure to screw this little hole right here to properly secure the card. If your card does not line up with the hole, don't worry, this isn't because you've installed your card wrong, it likely just means that your card is pretty heavy, and you just need to hold it into the correct place while you're screwing it in. Now this next step doesn't apply to everyone, however if you do see a little power port that looks like this on your graphics card, then make sure to grab the corresponding connector, which should look like this, from your power supply and plug it in. Right, and that is the end of this PC Parts Explained. I hope you enjoyed. If you didn't, leave a dislike. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll be seeing you in the next video. Goodbye.
Hello, do you receive my echo? My life is a part